Paul, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Okay. I'm going to just very quickly sort of set a stage for Anders to talk at a high level with a lot of big numbers. We're talking about an enormously complicated situation here between Crimea and the Donbass. As you can see, the idea is to ultimately get some compensation. To do that, you have to put values on individual assets and companies, groups of assets, groups of companies, and we're talking now historical values as of, say, 2014 when they were seized or 2015 when they were destroyed. And we're covering a really broad range of assets that I listed here: companies, real estate, cash, gas and oil reserves, coal reserves, even bank loans. I'm going to mention something about that very quickly. A lot, as Mr. Shemkiv mentioned, a vast amount of industrial property, plant, and equipment. When I threw this together, I forgot to mention, as an academic, it was a terrible oversight, universities. There were, just in the Donbass alone, there were 16 universities that were, confiscated, damaged, destroyed. This affected thousands of faculty and staff, tens of thousands of students who had to jump up and run away. They could not take with them their laboratories, their libraries, their records of past diplomas, records of current classes. Extremely disruptive to the lives of these folks, and extremely expensive. Universities are expensive to reproduce. Donetsk National University, they ended up in Vinnytsia, operating out of an old jewelry factory. Lugansk National University jumped, across the border to a small town, but they're obviously not operating under the best circumstances. So I don't know how you necessarily put a value on these, call them cultural assets, but the values are very huge. If we look over at the types of entities that are affected, Mr. Shemkiv talked a lot about, the large private enterprises and of course large state-owned enterprises. And as much as we care about those, we do have to also recognize that you have banks, both private and state, that were confiscated, damaged, destroyed, closed. You have a vast number of small and medium private enterprises that also suffered. And my favorite category, because not enough attention gets paid to that, is individuals and families. There were hundreds of thousands of apartments that were damaged, destroyed, stolen, because people had to jump and run away from them. There was cash on deposit in banks that families lost. There was a vast number of automobiles that were left behind, stolen, damaged, destroyed. A typical family, whether it's in America or Ukraine, the main asset of a family is its apartment or its house. And even if your apartment is fully intact, you're still looking at, in the Donbass, up to probably 80% would be my guess as an appraiser, 80% reduction in the value of a typical apartment, if you could sell it, if you could control the money once you did sell it. In Crimea, I would think residential property values would be declining at least 50%. So these, and my open rhetorical question is, how do we compensate the families for the loss of these assets? So I'm going to very quickly just show one more slide, because it's didn't get mentioned. We have to recognize that we have everything ranging from the actions of a recognized government, Russia, okay, that range from, again, the actions of a recognized government all the way to just pure banditry and everything in between. And my two favorite examples, the National Bank of Ukraine had 400 million US dollar equivalent in cash in storage in Crimea, which was simply stolen. Now that's not bad for a day's work. That's a lot of money, okay? And in the Donbass, Naftogaz Ukraine, and NOK, the national gas company, they had 400 million cubic feet of gas in storage in the Donbass worth about $200 million, and it was simply stolen. So how does one compensate? Because, you know, to compensate, somebody has to agree to be the compensator, but since we have no idea, you know, who stole the cash, who stole the gas, well, there you have it. I'm gonna leave it there, so because I want to listen to Anders.
Anders, you threw out a lot of figures. What's the bottom line price tag? Is it 27 billion and 37 billion?
$73 billion for Donbass, $27 billion for Crimea. That's just using Piketty. But if you would try to do it more carefully, you would get a higher number for Crimea.
Okay.
For a number of reasons, and you would get, in particular, for oil and gas. And Donbass, then you would have to ask what is the value of old factories, some of them that are quite run down.
Okay, so you're looking at least 100 billion as a minimum.
No, I look upon 100 billion as a reasonable number.
Okay, very good. And do you agree with that figure?
I do, probably as a minimum. You can put a value on assets, damaged, destroyed, stolen, abandoned, cannibalized. We've had all of the above. But those are assets. If you switch over and start looking at companies, and you say, well, what is the value of some of these companies that were nationalized in Crimea? Well, you now have to look at, you know, the forecasted future net cash flow that would accrue to the owners, whether that's private or state, from operating that company. And so you start with the value of the assets today, but when you start adding in, you know, legitimate, scientifically determined, reproducible results at the future value of companies, all that lost revenue to the owners or lost taxation to the government, suddenly these numbers become many times bigger. And so that's why I said...
Thank you, Jacques. Anders and Paul, I have a question for you. Is there a registry to catalog damaged and destroyed property? And if not, who should be in charge of such a registry?
Well, and even if you have a registry, you know, the ability of SCM or our client, we were working with Ukernafta, valuing their stolen gas stations in Crimea. The ability of large private enterprises, large state enterprises, to pursue legal restitution and compensation, that's one thing. But for, you know, 1.5 million internally displaced people who lost hundreds of thousands of flats and automobiles and cash in the bank, even if they're on a registry, who's going to represent them? Who's going to bear the cost and the burden to represent them? How are they going to be compensated? Who is going to compensate them? This brings us to this fascinating difference between Crimea and the Donbass. In Crimea, the Russian government has a very well organized, I would say nefarious, but it's a very well organized plan. And you'll notice there's not a lot of cannibalization that's going on there. You don't have companies being just operated into the ground. The cash is going out. You don't have companies being disassembled and removed because the Russians have a plan. And in the Donbass, as Jacques mentioned, you not only have companies where there's no investment, they're operating them, you know, like riding a dead horse, right? Just ride the horse till it dies, get the cash out. But then certain companies like Topaz, which Dmitry Shimkiv mentioned, a producer of military equipment, that facility was worth at least a few $100 million when it was operating, $300, $400, $500 million. It was a very, very valuable asset. And rather than operating that to nothing, they just disassembled it. They just literally cannibalized it and moved all the valuable assets back to Russia. So you see the Donbass literally like eating itself and just disintegrating, whereas in Crimea you see an organized attempt to you know, change the ownership. You could call it nationalization, confiscation, whatever. But you see an organized attempt to bring Crimea in whole as a valuable asset to be part of the Russian Federation, and you don't see that in the Donbass. And Donbass is truly a living hell now. The other thing that we have to point to for compensation issues, business is integrated. You have supply chains, and you can have an asset in the Donbass, whatever happens to it. It's nationalized, confiscated, stolen, destroyed, but it has knock-on effects down that supply chain throughout Ukraine or elsewhere in the world, because you're dependent on something coming from the Donbass to come to you, and you add value and you pass it on. And those are very real and very large losses that are adding up too. Extremely hard to put a value on because they're indirect, but nonetheless. I want to jump in very quickly because of the banking example. The Russian government in Crimea, this is organized, it's pretty destructive. The Russian government passed a special law for Crimea that canceled all bank loans that were owed to the Ukrainian State Savings Bank, Oshad Bank, or that were owned to Privat Bank, which, as the name implies, was Privat. and they just canceled the loans. This cost Oshad Bank at least $1 billion in losses, and it caused Privat Bank at least about $2.5 billion in losses from the loans just being canceled. That was individuals, including a lot of high government officials who in Crimea, who were business people, who had large loans that they had organized with Oshad Bank and with Privat Bank. So they had a personal incentive to, leave the country because they themselves were canceling large amounts of debt to their personal benefit. But that's an interesting sort of example of how Russia's kind of striking back at Ukraine.
Gotcha.
Melinda, to put it as a question, is anybody working on this? I'm sure Jacques Mendoza and his folks are working on that, which particularly touches them. But in a broader sense, is there any effort to really gather all these valuations and really come up with realistic numbers? Even something like, my big bugaboo is the gas in the Black Sea, that I've not heard anybody really put a realistic value on it. Simke said 1.6 trillion cubic meters. Well, how much is a 1.6 trillion cubic meters worth? At 50 cents a cubic meter, that's $800 billion.
Great, thank you.
To the best of my knowledge, the Ukrainian government does not have an organized approach to fully document and value according to international valuation standards, so that the valuations can withstand scrutiny. They don't have a program to do that. Not only do they need to do that, they need to do that in a hurry. Because I've had experience valuing assets that were seized by, say, Russian banks and the like, and you're always doing historical valuations. Yeah. And we're now 4 years into this, and the longer you wait, even if you have two, very friendly entities that agree that they're going to compensate, it gets harder and harder and harder to agree on a value that's based on data from 4 years or 5 years ago. And I would recommend that the Ukrainian government start with Crimea, because in Crimea we have a recognized government that is responsible and fully admits that they are responsible for the annexation of Crimea. And you still have mostly uncannibalized, okay? Russia took Crimea with the intention that it will be a valuable part of the Russian Federation. So you have information that still exists, unlike in the Donbass where records are destroyed. You have the companies operating. Now, you're not going to get cooperation, okay? We have figured out ways in our firm how to value assets even though you cannot get direct access to them. All right, there are ways, I won't go into it, but there are lots of ways in which you can get valuable numbers. And I would recommend the Ukrainian government put together a task force credible appraisers and start in Crimea because we can develop defensible numbers there. The Donbass, I don't know. The Donbass is a catastrophic situation. A lot of what's there can be valued. I mean, the companies of System Capital Management, they can be valued in terms of the business value, the asset value. But I would start with Crimea because it's actually easier.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, you mentioned realistic numbers. There are realistic numbers for the value of the oil and gas reserves in Crimea that were seized. It's 40 billion is a good number. Now someone will say, yeah, but that was 40 billion based on 2014, not today. The price is lower. But whoa. If I steal a car today worth $50,000, and then 4 years from now I agree to compensate, I can't say, well, I'm only going to compensate you 5,000 because I put a lot of miles on there. Okay, didn't change the oil. So it is the value as of the date that it was, stolen, destroyed, nationalized, whatever term you want to use. And again, we have to hurry because when as time goes on, it's going to be harder and harder to do. Okay, and I personally think that eventually some kind of compensation agreement. It may have to wait some years, maybe a new government, who knows, but at some point I think there can be some compensation agreement made between Ukraine and Russia concerning Crimea. The Donbass, who do you hold responsible?
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Member of Commerce, and thank you very much for the presentations. Definitely quite interesting and obviously very, very important for Ukraine. One of our companies is actually in a joint investment agreement with Chornomor Naftogaz, and two of the properties were actually now affected by the illegal occupation of Crimea, because the Russians now consider the offshore projects close to Crimea as their territorial waters. But I want to come back to valuation on the oil and gas assets. Dr. Osland, you mentioned 40 billion, and you mentioned 40 billion as sort of a number, which I don't know, I hear some numbers that are even higher than that. But strangely enough, Naftogaz of Ukraine, in their lawsuit against Russia, started with 5 billion, then has moved on to 7 billion, and then now I hear they added another one, so they're about 8 billion, which is, even if we take 40 as the number, 8 is very far from 40. Can you comment on that? Why such a huge difference, and how come it's not properly?
Oh, sure. There are two
Thank you.
different things. If you take the that 8 billion, that is focused exclusively on physical assets. Drilling platforms, special towers that were built for offshore operation, related infrastructure. A market value of that would be about $5 billion, fair market value. And the Ukrainian government has now added $3 billion in interest. Well, that's going to be a hard number to defend. The balance sheet value, if you just take the balance sheet of Chornomor Naftogaz, it's $2.5 billion. Okay, but those are just physical assets. The 40 billion is just the value of oil and gas reserves in the ground, based on a net price, net of extraction cost. So the 40 billion is oil and gas reserves, and the 8 billion is physical assets plus some interest, and that's the difference. So you need to add the two together. So there's at least 45 billion, and then the interest, again, that's going to be a little hard to defend.
The origin of the number 40 billion is a statement by the then Minister of Energy in 2014. So that's why people tend to use that number. I don't know how well considered it is.
Great. Do we?
Well, no, I just wanted to mention that, I'm glad that we're mentioning humanitarian issues again.
Absolutely.
There has been a looting of cultural artifacts from Crimea, especially Scythian gold that's been taken out, moved off to the Hermitage. The suits filed against some gold artifacts that were in, I believe, the Netherlands on a museum display that the Russians came after. There's been a decline in the number of foreign students coming to universities in Ukraine, because that tends to kind of, you know, the prospect of war scares you away. There has been a decline, as Anders mentioned, in foreign direct investment into Ukraine, because, you know, this kind of instability tends to spook students and their parents and investors. And, you know, again, those are, it's very hard to put a number on that for compensation. Last quick point, you know, the Ukrainian government itself has had to absorb, you know, for them, what are really huge costs in helping internally displaced persons with buying and renting flats. They have a special program to help subsidize folks, especially out of the Donbass, to buy and rent flats. And again, there's a lot of welfare services burdens that have been put on the government to take care of its citizens that have been displaced.
And yet housing remains a very, very vital
Sure,
issue. There's
sure.
a huge shortage and the prices are sky high.
Sure,
And Jacques can speak to that if we have time. But on your point I was glad you brought up National Donetsk University, and we've done quite a bit of reporting on the university. And what you say is true, that the number of foreign students did decline, but they are seeing the number of foreign students increasing again. So National Donetsk University reestablished itself in Vinnitsa, and it's doing well and flourishing, and they're starting to see you know, the student interest coming back.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point. You know, everything we're saying is kind of like negativity is a one-way street. Well, you know, negatives create positives. If you go down into Kherson Oblast on the Black Sea coast, especially Odessa Oblast, there's a huge booming new tourism industry there. And it's Ukrainian domestic investment, because everybody, you know, I don't know the numbers, but a large percentage of tourism that went to Crimea, of course, they were Ukrainian citizens. They don't go there. Well, where do they go? They're now coming to Odessa and Kherson. This is generating employment and a lot of investment, and a lot of it is purely Ukrainian domestic investment. That's quite good. And distance learning at universities has gotten a good sort of shot in the arm, because especially Lugansk naturally, they ended up with, they didn't have one campus. They're kind of scattered all over. So they've had to now rely less on the old person-to-person model of education, and they're now bringing in a lot of online education, distance learning. So, you know, Ukrainians, like everybody else in the world, they respond to adversity, and we are seeing some positive results. You know, I don't want to link, you know what I mean. But we are seeing the Ukrainian people, Ukrainian government respond to this adversity in their own positive way.
Absolutely. And the Atlantic Council last year did a report on Ukraine's IDPs. I'm one of its authors. My co-author is Dr. Lauren Van Meter. She's here. And the word we used over and over again was resilient. Ukraine's IDP community is resilient and impressive. We have time for one more question. I saw some hands. Could you give the microphone?
I saw an ambassador do this.
Oh, no, if we could get the microphone to this gentleman here, please.